What is up, my friends? Welcome to another global economic report. Today, I got a juicy one for you. Okay, we're going to talk about the Powell 60-minute interview, and we're going to talk about some other breadcrumbs that are going to create this storyline in this dialogue, which says and shows we're in trouble. Strap up. Let's get right into it, guys. Let's jump in. Right off the bat, if you want to show us some support, go ahead and click that like button, but let's go ahead and jump in. So after the interview, which happened a couple days ago, I started to dig in and really think about, like, okay, wait a second. Why is this guy doing a 60-minute interview? It must be damage control, right? Because the Fed is not supposed to be political at all, and they claim that they are not political. But talking about Trump, he didn't talk a lot about Trump. Powell basically just said, I don't think Trump can fire me. I plan on doing my job. I've got a 4-year term here, blah, blah, blah. So it wasn't like this huge thing, even though they put that in the headline. Convenient. But anyways, he did downplay the recession quite a bit, and he made some really interesting comments, which proves that this is more than political. Okay, so we're going to talk about Powell. We're going to dive through some old Bernanke stuff. I'm going to show you some other breadcrumbs, and we're gonna come to a conclusion here by the end of this thing. We've seen a bit of slowing, but still to healthy levels in the U.S. economy this year. I would say there's no reason why this economy can't continue to expand, he added. A weak retail sales report for December and a merger gain in jobs reported Friday have raised concerns that the slowdown may be more severe than the central banks now expect. Powell did not discuss the jobs report in the interview, but said spending popped back up in January. We don't feel any hurry to change our policy, our interest rate policy. I almost feel like it's opposite day with a lot of the stuff that these guys say. It's like you should assume that they are thinking about the exact opposite of what they say with a lot of these pieces. Not everything, but a lot of it. Like when they say things like don't panic, you should panic. Well, maybe not panic, but you should be concerned when they say things like, we don't feel any rush to change our interest rate policy. Oh, they're thinking about it day and night. They wouldn't have had all these late night meetings. There wouldn't be all this conversation. I believe the president met on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. Late night meetings that have never happened ever before to talk about interest rate policy. So there's an obvious turmoil happening right now between the Fed and it looks like this current administration and president. These interviews, you got to understand, I think are more so for damage control. Like if there's somebody's going to get this thing pinned on him, it's not going to be Powell, right? So it's once again, all these guys trying to, you notice how they all skirt accountability. And that's the thing that I think should bother most American people is it's like, if we screw up, if we don't pay our bills, if we make a mistake, everyone's waiting in line to tell us how we're a piece of shit and how we should be held to the highest letter of the law because we screwed up. But yet when it's flipped the other way, nobody shows up. Nobody gets fired. Nobody gets in trouble. What was the fallout from the 2009 bailout? Go ahead, take a second. I'm gonna grab some water here. Go ahead, think about this one. How many people got fired? Let me fill that in for you. None. Actually, I think one got fired. Okay, let's be fair. I think like one got fired. I got to dig that up so that I make sure I'm right. But my point is that most of the time, these guys get away with it, and there's no accountability. I see this as getting in front of what's going to come. I see that there's a big problem mounting, and this is how they're going to get in front of it because they can point back at this. And so that's how they're setting the breadcrumbs. Because again, the average person thinks, well, gosh, if they were in trouble, there's no way he'd have the balls to get on national television and tell everyone it's all right. Actually, he would. That's exactly what he would do. I think that's interesting. So now you've got the essence of what Powell said. Powell made one more important comment, which is going to be very relevant in just a minute. Let me go ahead and tell you now. And I quote, "We have unusually large number of people in their prime working years who are not in the labor force. The United States has a lower labor force participation rate than almost every other advanced country." We are at 63% right now, according to the Fed chart here for the St. Louis Fed. And this, again, to reinforce, is people in their prime working years. Okay, we're not talking about people outside of that. Well, what does this mean? This is going to come into play with deflation because there are certain things that trigger deflation, which we are going to talk about in just a second. This is from Ben Bernanke, which is a really famous article that he's now written back in 2002 because it was right before, 7 years later, he did the bailout. And he talks in detail about some very interesting things. I just read this for the first time today, and I got a lot out of it. As usual, all these links will be underneath the video, but let's just visit memory lane. How much was the bailout for 2009? Okay, well, according to the Levy Economics Institute that did a publication and a deep dive into this, through 2007 to 2009, they think it was 29 trillion. Okay, so there's this number of 16 trillion floating around, but then on top of that, we've got even more, which is how they came up with all of this. Estimates of the total amount of bailout funding provided by the Fed have ranged from its own lowball claim of 1.2 trillion to Bloomberg's estimate of 7.7 trillion just for the biggest banks, to the GAO tally of 16 trillion. But new research conducted as part of Ford Foundation project directed by senior scholar L. Randall Wray finds that the Fed's commitments in the form of loans and asset purchases to prop up the global financial system far exceeded even the highest estimates. 29 trillion. We've got this piece recently. Remember, I showed you this one too. Holding U.S. Treasuries, beware, Uncle Sam can't account for 21 trillion. So we got a 29 trillion, a 21 trillion floating around. Then this is off the Bernie Sanders website. We've got a 16 trillion in secret loans to bail out American and foreign banks, businesses during the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. That number's also floating around. So we've got three different numbers. Who gives a shit which one is right? It is a ton of money. And what's coincidental about it, oh God, it is a shit ton of money, and what's coincidental about it is it actually goes against Ben Bernanke's own words said 7 years just before then in 2002, which we'll get into in just a second. Now let's add in something that was just relevant to today. This just popped up today. In case you weren't familiar with what quantitative easing is, it just means spending. Okay, it's a fancy way of just saying the banks print more money and they spend it. What do they spend it on? Government bonds, treasury notes, things like that, like basically financial instruments. Okay, so what we're talking about here is European Central Bank has spent about 3 trillion on bond purchases over the last 4 years. During 2008 to 2015, the US spent 3.7 trillion. So this tweet right here triggered the outrage essentially, which is like it was like an AMA, I think, the European Central Bank. Why do they have a Twitter? They should just keep their mouth shut. But you know, they're pushing for this whole transparency thing. The Fed is pushing for more transparency, which we know they don't want that. And when we hear them speak on TV, like I said, we should assume it's opposite day. So where did you get the money for quantitative easing? Somebody asks. Pratt, as a central bank, we can create money to buy assets. What this is saying is that they can print money out of thin air. Now, this position on this piece that we're looking at right now, a little bit overly pessimistic. It's a pro-Bitcoin article, so okay, take that into consideration. But I do agree with him on the fact that he says it's interesting that they're comfortable enough to brag about it and kind of like nonchalantly just say it in a tweet. It should kind of make you feel uncomfortable to a degree, and it proves that they don't feel like anyone's ever going to come and knock on the door and hold them accountable. What most people don't realize is that inflation itself, in the government's best interest to keep inflation because it allows them to wash their debt. It's just how it is, okay? Inflation deteriorates purchasing power. Inflation is also a leading cause of income inequality, which is very interesting because you have a lot of elite players and very rich and wealthy players that are always talking about income inequality and how they want to fix it, and they donate the billions of dollars to do what, I don't know. You know, there's over 2,100 billionaires now. It's like, dude, you could just give everyone a little bit of your money and that would fix the problem if that was actually your intention. I actually don't think that would be the best way to do it personally, but I think it's better when people can earn money in a value equation, value given, value received, versus just giving it, right? So anyways, my point is that inflation is actually, I didn't know about this article. I just read it for the first time from his piece, but it's basically income inequality, does inflation matter? And the conclusion is yes, written in January 1998, talking about South Africa. Inflation is not good. It decreases purchasing power. Like if the inflation rate, which right now it's 2.40, last year the average for 2018 was 2.44. That means that you have to make 2.44% more money to get the same purchasing power that you had at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year. Does that make sense? If you're getting paid the same amount every single year, but inflation is going up, or inflation even exists every year, it is a slow erosion of your purchasing power. Yes, it is. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, that's why things look even worse. That's why you go to the store and you are paying $3, $5 for water. That is inflation. Now we've got this piece, the European Central Bank piece. Let's go back to Bernanke here and talk talk about this because there's some really interesting stuff that he brought up. Okay, so let's talk about what he thinks causes deflation. Here it is. With inflation rates now quite low in the United States, however, some have expressed concern that we may soon face a new problem, the danger of deflation or falling prices. This concern is not purely hypothetical, is brought home to us whenever we read newspaper reports about Japan, where what seems to be a relatively moderate deflation, a decline in consumer prices of about 1% per year, has been associated with years of painfully slow growth, rising joblessness, hint, 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 63% of the prime workforce only working, okay? Starting to piece that together, rising joblessness and apparently intractable financial problems in the banking and corporate sector. So it's one of many problems, but Powell's now mentioned it, kind of breezed over it. Bernanke's talked about this. I would believe and I would assume that most economists would talk about it as well. So now let's jump to, so is deflation a threat to the economic health of the United States? Not to leave you in suspense, I believe the chance of significant deflation in the United States in the foreseeable future is extremely small for two principal reasons. The first, these reasons aren't really that valid too. The first is the resilience and structural stability of the US economy itself. 7 years later, that proved to be completely and utterly false. Structural stability, if we're talking about structural in terms of our roads and our water and our bridge system, that is not up to speed at all. And there's plenty of independent research now that's been released on that because we are not taking care of our actual infrastructure. But structural stability can mean many things. I think just they mean overall the way that the economy is set up and how they leverage the Fed, so on and so forth. Over the years, the U.S. economy has shown a remarkable ability to absorb shocks of all kinds, to recover and to continue to grow. Flexible and efficient markets for labor and capital, an entrepreneurial tradition, and a general willingness to tolerate and even embrace technological and economic change all contribute to this resiliency, meaning we can take it in the ass. A particularly important protective factor in the current environment is the strength of our financial system. Mind you, he's saying this in 2002, 7 years later, it is completely null and void. The second bulwark against deflation in the United States, and the one that I will focus on in these remarks today, is the Federal Reserve System itself. The Congress has given the Fed the responsibility to preserving price stability. And that's what they always talk about, right? Like, and that's fair. Their job is to preserve price stability, and it's in their best interest to keep inflation going. I'm confident that the Fed would take whatever means necessary to prevent significant deflation in the United States, and moreover, that the U.S. Central Bank, in cooperation with other parts of the government, as needed, has sufficient policy instruments to ensure that any deflation that might occur would be both mild and brief. Deflation is defined as a general decline in prices with emphasis on the word general. At any given time, especially in low inflation economy like that of our recent experience, prices of some goods and services will be falling. Price declines in a specific sector may occur because productivity is rising and costs are falling more quickly in that sector than elsewhere, or because the demand for the output of that sector is weak relative to the demand for other goods and services. It's basically just has to do with supply and demand. And when that declines low enough and you're in a low interest rate economy, then it can fall. Remember, there isn't any room except for 3 different countries right now for a 500 base point cut to cut interest rates. The United States, as well as most other countries, do not have that leeway. They don't have that cushion right now. And I believe New Zealand had about 250 base points of cushion. So nobody has that cushion. So I hope you see where we're going here with this. We're talking about deflation, and there's all this talk about negative interest rates, bringing in this dual currency system. Yeah, okay. I think you're starting to get it. This just goes on with cause and effect of deflation. Interesting if you didn't know what deflation already was. So preventing deflation, he actually brings up some really, really valid points at the top. Obviously leaving yourself enough buffer zone, he calls it, for the inflation rate, which they do not have right now. I just mentioned that. So there's no buffer zone right now. That's the most obvious precautionary thing that you can do. And then next he starts talking about changing the treasury bond yields and some really deep stuff. And what did he end up doing? He ended up just printing money and giving it out. And nobody knows to what extent that was actually done to. Okay, here's the piece that I wanted to show you. Yep, this is one that I'd highlighted before. The Fed should and does use its regulatory and supervisory powers to ensure that the financial system will remain resilient if financial conditions change rapidly. And at times of extreme threat to financial stability, the Federal Reserve stands by to use the discount window and other tools to protect the financial system, as it did during 1987 stock market crash and the September 2001 terrorist attacks. Third, as suggested by a number of studies, when inflation is already low and the fundamentals of the economy suddenly deteriorate, the central bank should act more preemptively and more aggressively than usual to cut rates. I've mentioned these three pieces from 2000, 2000, and 2002 already in a previous video. By moving decisively and early, the Fed may be able to prevent the economy from slipping into deflation with the special problems that entails. In the top section here, he talks about treasuries and changes and manipulation that could happen there. He says here the Fed can inject money into the economy in several other ways. For example, the Fed has the authority to buy foreign government debt as well as domestic government debt. Potentially, this class of assets offers huge scope for the Fed operations, as the quantity of foreign assets eligible for purchase by the Fed is several times the U.S. stock government debt. And he's broken this down really eloquently. And then he steps back and says, I need to trend carefully here because the economy is a complex and interconnected system. Fed purchases of the liabilities of foreign governments have the potential to affect a number of financial markets, including the market for foreign exchange. In the United States, the Department of Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, is the lead agency for making international economic policy, including policy towards the dollar. And the Secretary of Treasury has expressed the view that the determination of the value of the US dollar should be left to free market forces. Okay, hold on, time out here. But then 7 years later, you literally just go to the printing press and print up whatever you want. Do you see the disconnect here? And this is how it always is. It's almost like a magic show, like sleight of hand, right? And here's the infamous line that everyone talks about and references here. A money finance tax cut is essentially equivalent to Milton Friedman's famous helicopter drop of money. So what he's talking about here is that tax cuts are on the table. A broad-based tax cut, for example, accommodated by a program of open market purchases to alleviate any tendency for interest rates to increase, would almost certainly be an effective stimulant to consumption and hence to prices. They didn't even do that. I don't think they did that after 2009. I got to research that more. If I'm wrong, go ahead and comment below. But not to my knowledge did they do tax cuts. But here's what I wanted to show you here. A tax cut financed by money creation is the equivalent of a bond finance tax cut plus an open market operation in bonds by the Fed, and so arguably no explicit coordination is needed. However, a pledge by the Fed to keep the Treasury's borrowing costs low, as would be the case under my preferred alternative of fixing portions of the Treasury yield curve, might increase the willingness of the fiscal authorities to cut taxes. Some have argued on theoretical rather than empirical grounds that a money finance tax cut might not stimulate people to spend money because the public might fear that future tax increases will just take back the money that they received. This is in a 2002 study. This is what I want you to listen to. Egertson provides a theoretical analysis showing that if government bonds are not indexed to inflation and certain other conditions apply, a money finance tax cut will in fact raise spending and inflation. In brief, the reason is that people know that inflation erodes the real value of the government's debt, and therefore it is in the interest of the government to create some inflation. Hence, they will believe the government's promise not to take back in future taxes the money distributed by means of tax cut. That in and of itself is very telling into what they think the psychology of all the American people is and what they're willing to just take. You know what I mean? What they're willing to handle. If you want to read this, link is underneath the video. We went through these guys. You got your numbers there. Oh, this is the last piece I wanted to leave you with. And then we're going to talk and wrap up on this dual currency system. Okay, this is the effective Fed fund rate. Even if we were to chop this out in the 80s, right? And let's just bring it back down to like this normal level here in this 10% range. We can't get higher highs, okay? If you're a chart reader, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We have lower highs here going on. Look at this descending line here. You see it? Descending line of lower highs. So what is our max here? We have to keep this going. We can't go above, what, 2.5% here? Which is right around where we're at now. So what are we gonna do? we're going to have to go lower. So this is where we're at right now. We're going to have to go lower, which this once again reopens up this whole conversation and makes it very convenient, doesn't it? That we have the IMF talking about negative interest rates and how they can work. I shot a whole video on this. I'll link it at the end of this in the end card if you want to check that out. But basically, oh, here's that piece I was just telling you about. 3 to 6% points, but only 3 countries, Turkey, Mexico, and Iceland, have that kind of wiggle room. These two have 500 points. This has 250 points. The rest of these countries are fucked. They have no room to maneuver. So this is where the whole conversation is being injected with this dual currency system, meaning e-money. You better believe it, there'll still be an inflation rate because they can't get away from that. They got to be able to wash their own debt. But yeah, Sweden is only like 2% of transactions are done with cash. So Sweden is like the #1 country that's mostly cashless. And that makes you kind of wonder too, like what's the real intention with digital currency? You know, you got this mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto behind Bitcoin. Like what's the real reason this is all conveniently dropped right after the financial crisis of 2009? The original white paper was written at the end of 2008. So it was right at the heat of this whole thing. And again, we can all believe that the intentions were pure and true. We just have a lot of coincidences happening here with the rise of digital currency as cash is going out the door. Cash is a way to preserve some of your purchasing power, yes, but in the face of inflation, not really. Okay, so even the notion of just holding onto your money underneath your pillow is not a good idea. You need to invest into real appreciating assets. You see in the breadcrumbs here, we started at the Powell conversation. We touched back and seen what Bernanke had to say. The central banks obviously don't mind admitting that they just print money. Funny enough, if you're in the cryptocurrency space at all, like that's like suicide to talk about just mindlessly printing or mindlessly increasing the coin supply of a cryptocurrency. It's like a huge no-no to say that, yet we accept it with the central banks. And I think that's part of the game here, is that's why so many people are so passionate about cryptocurrencies, is because it should represent everything that the banks aren't and everything that the banks aren't doing. Okay, so here's an illustration once again. To illustrate, suppose your bank announced negative 3% interest rate on your bank deposit of $100 today. Suppose also that the central bank announced that cash dollars would now become a separate currency that would depreciate against an e-dollar by 3% per year. The conversion rate of cash dollars into e-dollars would hence change from 1 to 97 cents over the year. After a year, there would be 97 e-dollars left in your bank account. Okay, this is them taking your money. Let's see what happens next. We've got all these breadcrumbs. I've shot 3-4 videos talking about in depth these different pieces. We've got them slowly dripping out that, hey, maybe we do this. The IMF and other agencies saying, hey, maybe we do digital currencies. We got Ripple looking really good as a prime contender, or maybe some of these in-house currencies, they're going to figure out a way to make those work at a higher level, JPM coin, Facebook coin, etc. But I'll be interested to see what happens next. And I'm not really one of those guys to say I told you so, but there's enough pieces here now that if you are a logical thinker, you are questioning what's going on, what's really going on. We have a decrease in our labor force, which is one of the bigger deflationary events. We have no inflation room to go, nothing more to give, and we're talking about now going into negative interest rates. We're citing all these papers, there's all this research going into it, and we have Powell saying that they are not in a rush to change the interest rate policy right now. All right, my friends, that's all I've got for you. If you like this video, if you like the research that I just compiled in the way I showed it to you, click the like button. That gives us so much support, you have no idea. If this is your first time to the channel, click subscribe, hit the bell notification. If you got something to say, I'd love to hear it. If I missed anything and you want to piece that together, go ahead and place a comment underneath this video. Last little bit, if you want to support us financially, hey guys, we need your help now more than ever. We don't make a ton of money off the AdSense on these videos, so every little bit goes a long way. We got people pledging just as low as $1 per month, and I know that this is groveling a little bit, but I really appreciate all the support you guys give us, hence why I talk about it all the time, because $1 does go a long way with the work that we do, and I want to keep doing this full time for you guys, for everyone to help shift the consciousness here. And so if you can support us, would absolutely love that. If not, it's all good. Be on the lookout, more videos dropping soon, friends. Bye.